First of all, we have Brian Michael Jenkins, who's a senior advisor to the president at the RAND Corporation. He is the author of several RAND monographs of terrorism-related topics. In anticipation of the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, Mr. Jenkins spearheaded the RAND effort to take stock of America's policy reactions and to give thoughtful consideration to future strategies. He will also bring his perspective to the lasting legacy of 9/11, discuss how the threats to our country have evolved over time, and what are the new challenges moving forward.
I've had the privilege of working with Tom before on a commission that was back in the mid-1980s on the design of the Embassy of the Future. And in that endeavor, as well as in this current endeavor, looking at the nation's capital, I have to start off by admitting to be a fraud. All of the people in these activities with me are architects or engineers or urban planners, and I have none of those credentials, but instead have tried to focus my remarks on the issue of the threat we face. Thinking about, by the way, being among others who have other skills than my own, I'm always relieved when I get to sit in the audience first and then walk up to the stage, as opposed to stepping right up on the stage. I can't help but recall some years ago, particularly in looking at this very elegant, large conference room, I was scheduled to address an audience of senior FBI officials and senior law enforcement officials in Southern California, where I live. I drove down to the hotel where the meeting was to take place. I was in Newport Beach somewhere. There was the usual jam on the freeway. I arrived late, no time to park the car, tossed the keys to the doorman, ran into the hotel lobby and down the stairway where all the ballrooms were. There was a nervous young man at the bottom of the stairway saying, "Are you our speaker?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sorry I'm late." And he said, "No problem, we've introduced you already, come with me," grabbed me by the arm. And instead of coming in through the back or through the audience, we actually stepped right up onto the podium from a little doorway off stage right here. And people applauded, and I began to speak. 2 minutes into the talk about terrorism, I noticed people looking rather confused, pressed on for another couple of minutes. Now people were looking positively alarmed, glanced around at the huge banner behind me and found out that I was speaking to 200 Southern Californian proctologists. Of course, somewhere in the building, there were 200 senior FBI agents alarmedly listening to a proctologist. In the recent days leading up to the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we've certainly had ample opportunity to reflect upon the experience of the past 10 years and to assess where we are in this continuing contest. Sometimes news media oversimplify this into a single question: what's the score? In fact, I find this question irritating, but was asked again recently. Mr. Jenkins, in the global war on terror, what's the score? I shot back, it's 3-2. That satisfied the reporter for about 4 or 5 seconds on the air, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, 3-2, who's ahead?" I said, "That's a much more complicated question." The fact is that it is complicated. 10 years after 9/11, there is a remarkable lack of consensus among the analysts as to exactly where we are in this campaign. Certainly some would assert that Al-Qaeda is on the road to defeat, that they're on the ropes, although apparently still capable of putting us on national alert, as we just were this last weekend with a new potential threat. And yet, coming through the airport on my way here today, I saw a book title that said, "Why We Are Still Losing the War on Terror." Now, part of the complexity comes from the fact that our terrorist foes really represent many things: an ideology, a global terrorist campaign, a universe of like-minded fanatics, increasingly a conveyor for individual discontents. There is consensus among the analysts that the death of Osama bin Laden does not spell the end of Al-Qaeda's terrorist campaign. In fact, the elevation of Ayman al-Zawahiri as his successor guarantees the continuation of the strategy of going after the far enemy, the Western infidels, essentially us. But there's also consensus that as a consequence of the dispersal of al-Qaeda's easily accessible training camps, the decimation of its leadership, the continuing pressure on the organization, perhaps most of all because of unprecedented cooperation among the world's intelligence services and law enforcement organization, al-Qaeda's operational capabilities have been degraded. The al-Qaeda we confront today is far different from the al-Qaeda that we were looking at 10 years ago. It is much more decentralized, much more dependent on its affiliates and field commands, much more dependent on its ability to inspire, to recruit individuals to carry out attacks wherever they are. In fact, it has embraced a strategy of do-it-yourself terrorism. Fortunately, in this country, despite the exhortations, the recruiting efforts largely on the internet, that has produced only a tiny turnout. In the decade since 9/11, we are looking at approximately 200 individuals that have been arrested as a consequence of attempting to join a jihadist front abroad, or providing material support to one of these groups, or more seriously, attempting to plot to carry out terrorist activities in this country. In fact, 32 plots have been uncovered since 9/11. Most of them immature schemes rather than convincing operational plans, yet had they not been uncovered and succeeded, we would be looking at a higher level of terrorism than we have seen. What they show us is that our terrorist foe has deadly ambitions. In fact, their ambitions run into the fantasy world of weapons of mass destruction, which people still worry about, but of declining capabilities, and that's important. So still determined, but declining capabilities. Now, if we were to transport ourselves from here in Washington to Waziristan, there would be a different set of PowerPoints on the screen, and if we looked at what was on al-Qaeda's PowerPoints, how they might assess the situation, they would say that they have succeeded to a great deal. Their struggle, they realize, will transcend their lifetimes. They would assert that they have survived the infidels' mightiest blows, that their communications have increased and improved, and indeed they have, that the ideology has spread far beyond al-Qaeda itself, that the enemy, the United States, has been exposed as an aggressor and has been lured into costly military efforts that ultimately will fail, that their affiliates in the Arabian Peninsula, in Iraq, North Africa, Somalia, are extremely active, that new fronts are opening up for their activities in Saharan Africa, in Nigeria, that their enemies, Mubarak in Egypt, Ali in Tunisia, Gaddafi in Libya, have been struck down, that the infidels are weary of the war in Afghanistan and ultimately will withdraw in defeat, that the United States is in financial crisis, for which they claim some credit, and that even only small blows are needed to provoke American overreaction. Indeed, that the United States, in their view, lives in fear and will bankrupt itself with security. In reality, as I say, despite some of their fantasies about weapons of mass destruction, 4 tactics have dominated their activities since 9/11, and that really guides our thinking when it comes to security. One is the sabotage of aircrafts, not hijackings. I'm not sure that's viable for them anymore, but sabotage of aircraft, they've tried a number of times since 9/11. Large truck bombs, the kind of threat that we faced this weekend. Attacks on surface transportation, which they see really as a killing field. I mean, just to keep in mind a stunning statistic, since 9/11 there have been 75 terrorist attacks on airliners and airports worldwide, resulting in 157 deaths. During the same period of time, since 9/11 worldwide, there have been over 1,800 attacks on surface transportation, on trains and buses, public transportation, with over 3,900 fatalities. So we're looking at something like 25 times the number of fatalities in surface transportation. The fourth tactic that has caused great concern are so-called active shooters. That is the kind of attack that we saw in Mumbai, where 10 well-trained individuals, heavily armed with automatic weapons, killed 162 people. In fact, 2 of them killed 56 people in the Central Rail Terminal in Mumbai itself. Or the attack that we saw in this country by Major Nidal Hassan, when he killed 13 of his fellow soldiers and wounded 31 others at Fort Hood, Texas. Or the most recent event in Oslo, where a man not only set off a large vehicle bomb in Oslo in front of government buildings, but then at a separate venue was responsible for scores of deaths. So that's the kind of a threat that we're really facing right now, and it does raise some questions about how we do this going forward when it comes to security, and there's some real issues here. How do we, first big question that you struggle with is, do you protect individual properties, individual buildings, or do you try to create a secure zone around a cluster of buildings? An example of that would be the ring of security that surrounded city center Belfast during the IRA's bombing campaign, or the so-called Ring of Steel around London's financial district following 2 devastating IRA bombings in the city of London, or the security zone that has been set up to protect the financial district in Lower Manhattan in New York. So is that your approach, or do you take an individual building approach, which is less orderly, which results sometimes in things being very uneven, both in terms of security and in terms of the aesthetics? We know that these security measures work. They do displace the risk. They don't end terrorism. They push the terrorists to other, usually less lucrative targets, but they also affect lives. They affect commerce. They can be extremely disruptive, in addition to being ugly and simply incompatible with an open society, which we are. We also see another trend over the long run, which is to move away from, in a sense, constructing almost a neo-medieval society with walls and bollards and things of that sort. By the way, these terms actually do come out of medieval fortifications, so there's long precedent to these. But moving away from actual physical barriers and physical perimeters and moving more toward domain awareness, that is the increased use of closed-circuit television, cameras, and things of this sort, so that people can have a better idea of what's going on and what might be a potential threat. But those also raise serious questions about privacy in public places, about what is appropriate. The United Kingdom has gone in this direction. The United States has, to a certain degree, adopted some of these tactics in places like, for example, New York and on our public transport systems, but they raise questions. So this is a thing that we are grappling with right now, in my view, in terms of security, and I'll leave it to my colleagues with proper credentials to address how we can take on some of those challenges. Tom, you want to follow me up here? Thank you very, very much.